Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I am your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. Today, Justin and I talk about reasons that operators may shut in producing wells, and including when they do this to prevent issues like frac interference, which we explain what that is and why it may be a concern. And we recorded this episode in December of 2019 before the crash in crude oil prices and before the coronavirus pandemic hit. That said, the concepts that we discuss in this episode are relevant regardless of the reason for shutting in production. And I will say that it's probably even more relevant with what's going on today with current prices of $20 to $30 for West Texas Intermediate crude oil. And as many of you know, operators have shut in production that is not economic to produce at those prices. This is an episode where you'll want to listen closely about the things that you should think about with respect to shut-in royalty clauses in your oil and gas lease. So stay tuned for that. And again, when prices recover and operators start completing wells again, you'll also know what to look for and the questions to ask regarding your wells when it comes to frac interference, which we'll dive into. And in case you missed it, we dove a little bit deeper into shut-in royalty payments in a previous episode. That was our conversation with Spencer Cox, who's an attorney with Burns Charest LLP. And you can find that conversation in episode 53 of the Mineral Rights Podcast. And in that episode, we talk a lot about negative royalties. But at the end, you can listen to when we talk in depth about shut-in royalty payments in the current price environment and some of the legal issues that you need to be aware of. As always, please leave us a review in iTunes or wherever you are listening to this. It only takes a minute, and it really helps us out in gaining exposure so that other mineral and royalty owners can benefit from this information as well. So let's jump right into our conversation about shut-in wells and frac interference. Justin Williams joins me today. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me as always.
Thanks for coming on the show. And today we're going to talk about shut-in wells and frac interference or frac hits. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those mean here in a second. But before we do that, just a reminder that you can find the show notes to this episode at mineralrightspodcast.com. As always, we ask a favor to please go on to Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use to listen to this and leave a rating and review. And if you have any questions you'd like us to answer on an upcoming episode, you can do so via email at feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Justin, let's go ahead and dive in.
Sounds good. And one of the common questions that we get is I look on the State Oil and Gas Commission website and see that a well on my property has the status of shut in. What does this mean? It means the well is not currently producing, and like water piping in your house, like closing the shutoff valve, when you open the faucet, nothing comes out. So Matt, why don't you tell us a few of the reasons that commonly happens?
Sure. Thanks, Justin. Yeah. And for an existing well, we'll talk about the first scenario. Let's say that you have an existing well. It's a standalone well. There's no other activity going on nearby. There could be a couple of different reasons why the operator decided to shut in the well. It could be as simple as there's an operational issue that they need to go in and fix, and it's just a matter of time for them to schedule that and to perform that work, and then they'll go back and then turn the well on and then start producing again. And so when they do that, you'll hear the term workover. And so they may need to work over the well. If it's on a rod pump or a pump jack that you see out there pumping along, it could be that they need to fix something mechanically that's gone wrong with either the sucker rods or the tubing. Maybe there's a hole in the tubing that they need to pull the tubing and replace that joint that is affected. Something like that. So they would go in and actually perform work on the well, and they'll come in and then turn it back on. And another common reason, so let's say you do have some existing wells on your property or on your lease, and is a lot of activity going on nearby. And what they may end up doing is shut in that old vertical well because they've drilled these new horizontal wells, and maybe they're going to eventually go in and actually plug and abandon the old vertical well that was there holding the lease. And so this is common in areas where maybe they initially drill a vertical well to sort of assess the potential of an area after they've determined that it is economic to go ahead and drill additional horizontal wells. This is usually a couple of years down the road, after they've sort of assessed the potential of the area. They may come back in and decide to develop that acreage, and so fully develop it and drill, a dozen wells or however many wells, depending on the spacing and that formation in your area. And then when they go and want to complete those, in order to prevent any issues with that old vertical well, and because they're maybe producing out of the same formation, they're going to just go ahead and plug and abandon it because they'll have other wells that'll hold that lease. And so that is another potential reason why it might be shut in. It could just be a thing where they're shutting it in preparation for plugging it and abandon that well after they've drilled and completed those new horizontal wells. And so in that case, it would just be a matter of time, hopefully, before you would start to see royalties again, and hopefully a lot larger royalty checks if they do have some good performing horizontal wells that are drilled. So those are kind of two situations if you have vertical well, and those two different scenarios that could occur. And another sort of temporary situation where a well may be shut in temporarily, again, when they're doing that additional development work, maybe they're drilling some infill wells and developing the rest of the acreage and drilling those horizontal wells. And what they usually do in that case is they'll look at any existing wells that are nearby and the distance of those existing wells to the new wells. And a lot of times you'll hear the term parent well and a child well. Well, that well that was drilled first is called the parent well, and they're going in and drilling additional wells next to that, and those are called children or child wells. And so what they want to do there is actually shut in the existing well to prevent what is called a frac hit, or to minimize the effects of a frac hit. And a frac hit, or this is sometimes called frac interference, or there's other terms for it, but basically what that means is when you go in and hydraulically fracture a new well, the adjacent well may see an increase in that downhole pressure, or in extreme case, it'll actually have mechanical damage caused to that well or damage to the formation. And that existing well may actually start producing that frac water or sand that was pumped downhole into the new well. And so in that case, that it's not a good situation, because performance of that existing well would have been adversely affected, not to mention potentially the new wells. And so what they want to do is prevent that. And so they shut in that well to increase the downhole pressure on that existing well to help minimize any of those adverse effects. And so a lot of times that would be a temporary scenario where they're shutting in that existing well, but they have plans to turn it back on after they've completed those the child wells. And they may actually perform additional work on those existing wells to mitigate those negative consequences that I mentioned. And that could be include actually refracturing the parent well. And so they may actually go in, and after they've drilled those new horizontal child wells, go in and complete all of them, including the parent well. There's lots of different ways this is done, and companies sort of analyze the data as they're going through and developing an area to determine what the best course of action is in their specific case based on the information that they have. And so this is a very common scenario, especially in these unconventional basins where we're seeing more infill drilling going on, and going back and actually completing the new wells that are drilled, and having to manage the existing wells that are there. And so The final reason I'll say for why a well would show up with a shut-in status in the Oil and Gas Commission's website is if a new well is drilled before that well is brought online, sometimes it'll show up as being shut in. And when they drill a new well and don't complete it or frack it right away, there may be many reasons for that. A lot of that is more kind of financial in nature. So it could be for budgetary reasons. Maybe they have capital budget to spend towards the end of the year. They want to spend that, and they do so by drilling those wells and getting them ready to produce, but they may hold off on actually completing them. And those wells that are drilled but uncompleted, those are called DUCs or DUC. And so that's a drilled and uncompleted well. So it may just be that they want to get an inventory of wells that are drilled so they can more effectively utilize a frac crew to go and complete multiple wells at one time, because maybe it's a little bit less expensive and they can keep that crew working continuously, which is more efficient and more effective. And so, again, like I said, those are sometimes showing up as shut-in status in the State Oil and Gas Commission website. And again, that would hopefully be a temporary thing, although there is quite an inventory of ducks out there across a lot of the unconventional basins. It may be several months before you see any activity on those wells, and even to the extent that it's, sitting out there for a year or more that's drilled but uncompleted. Again, if there's any questions about the status of a well, regardless if it's shut in or whatever it is, obviously the best way to find out more is to just contact the operator directly and their owner relations department. And a lot of times they'd be happy to share what the status is and what's going on. Justin, in your case, have you run into this, and sort of what kind of ways have you gone about finding out information?
Absolutely. So we have ran into it in West Texas, where, like you mentioned, they had a parent well and were drilling child wells off, and for a short period of time, they would shut in the main well to frack or drill those are the child wells off the main one. And so, as a mineral right owner or royalty owner, it just looked like a bit of a pause in the royalties. And when we contacted them, they let us know that they were working on fracking new wells and that they would have it back operational and producing soon.
Good. Yeah, that's a very common scenario. Like in Justin's case, just contact them and they'll let you know what the reason is. And if a well is shut in, though, for a longer period of time, as you remember when we talked about the leasing episode, we talked about a shut-in royalty. And one of the clauses in your lease would be that shut-in royalty clause. And what this is intended to do is to provide some flexibility for the operator to allow them to shut it in for a period of time to, like we've talked about, for these various reasons that we've mentioned, but then still hold the lease. Because, technically, if the well is shut in or if there's no wells that are producing on the property, then they could lose the lease depending on the language. So they want that shut in royalty clause in there. And what it will say is that if there's a well capable of producing oil or gas, but the well is shut in, whether before or after production, it's considered that oil and gas is being produced while the well is shut in, for the purposes of holding the lease. And when the lease is continued in force in this manner, it'll say that the lessee shall pay the lessor an amount of, $1 per net mineral acre per year, or $5, or whatever the amount is that you negotiated in that lease. And it gives them from a period from the date that the well was shut in, and that they can pull the trigger on this clause. So usually it's like 120 days or some period of time that after that has gone by, that if the well is still shut in, that then they can continue to hold the lease by making these shut in royalty payments. It's important too when this goes back to why it's important to look at the details on these leases, but that shut in royalty clause should also have a deadline associated with it. And, for example, it may say that the lease may not be maintained in force by the payment of shut in royalties for any period in excess of 2 consecutive years from the day the well is shut in, or again, whatever that time period is specifically in your lease. So that's important that you have that from that 120 days to then 2 years after that well is shut in, that they can pay you shut in royalty payments in order to hold the lease. And if they continue to shut that well in, or if the well is not producing after that deadline passes, then it could be that you have the ability to negotiate a new lease on your land, because that previous lease would have then lapsed, basically. So again, it's something you'd want to review the specific language in your oil and gas lease and consult with an attorney to get guidance there. But again, that's another potential scenario. Again, this is a situation if you do get into where they're paying you shut-in royalty payments, you want to find out what their plans are. Definitely contact them to find out more, whether it's a maintenance issue that it's gonna take longer to resolve, or if it's something where it's going to be more permanent in nature, and so that you can get some intel, hopefully, and go from there. So.
Absolutely. And in my experience, the operators, when they do shut in a well, they're pretty prepared for the royalty owners to come asking reasons, and typically have a reason prepared to tell the mineral owners or royalty owners.
So yeah, and this is a short episode this time, just a little mini-sode, just to talk about this specific question that I've seen several times, and just wanted to get that out there in case you do run into this situation. Again, if you have any questions about your specific oil and gas lease, definitely consult with a qualified attorney in your jurisdiction. They can help decipher, what is going on, and potentially, if you feel that an operator is taking advantage of that situation, they can help you contact them on your behalf to help resolve that situation. But hopefully, if you do see the shut-in status of any wells that are on leases where you own the property, then hopefully it's for one of the reasons like Justin mentioned, where they're drilling some child wells and they're just getting ready to complete those. And so it's more of a preventive measure. And then hopefully you'd see a nice boost in royalty checks coming in the future. That's it for this time. And thanks again for listening. Thanks again, Justin, for your help.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.